In this video, I'm gonna walk you through why I think training young kids to develop bat speed and hit for power is actually way more important than training them to just make contact. Now, I know that probably sounds like a pretty controversial idea because if you've grown up around baseball or softball, you've probably heard things like, hey, just make contact, Johnny. Just put the ball in play. Don't worry about swinging so hard yet. And look, on the surface, that advice, that all sounds great, right? But let me show you why I started thinking about this completely differently. This is my 12-year-old daughter hitting her first home run to the opposite field. And she did this in 12U, even though she was basically the smallest girl on her team, standing only about 5 feet tall. And the reason she was able to do this wasn't because she was some genetically gifted freak kid, but actually came from something that I learned from a guy by the name of Dr. Greg Rose over at the Titleist Performance Institute, where he's that kind of golf guru in the world where it comes to biomechanics and athletic development. And he was sharing something on stage really interesting about what was happening in the golf community, where for like the entire history of golf, right, the traditional advice has always been, don't swing too hard, just focus on making good contact with the ball. Sound familiar, right? But a group of coaches and researchers in golf started challenging that idea. And what they began experimenting with was this. Instead of training young golfers to focus on ball striking first, they started focusing on developing rotational explosiveness earlier in the kid's athletic career. And then later, once that explosiveness was built, then they started focusing on the striking the ball purely. And what they started noticing was really interesting. These young golfers were growing up and becoming players who started to hit the ball farther than previous generations. And in fact, on the amateur circuit, for the first time in history, the amateurs started to average more than the pros were averaging on their drives off the tee. And they were still extremely good at ball striking. So they didn't lose the contact quality skills. They simply just changed the order that they trained those things. And the reason this seemed to work had to do something with what researchers were noticing about athletic development in kids, where there appears to be certain neurological learning windows when kids are young, where their brains are especially good at learning certain types of movement patterns. But once those windows close, those abilities become much harder to train later in life. And one of those big categories inside those windows were the skills around rotational explosiveness. So the huge takeaway from this research was that while the windows for training rotational explosiveness appeared to close fairly early in a kid's life, the windows for learning the skills required for ball striking and making quality contact don't seem to close in that same way. So if you think about that, it creates a really interesting idea, right? Where maybe, just maybe here, it's actually smarter to train kids' explosive movements first and then train them contact quality later. Because I can't tell you how many kids make it to high school or college and they can hit the ball, but now they don't have enough juice to make it to the next level. So while I was digging into all this stuff, I came across something else that really caught my attention, where researchers that studied youth athletic development started identifying 7 major categories of movement that kids need to develop good motor control in before they hit puberty. And if those movement patterns don't get locked in during that time and before puberty, their ability to express strength and power later in their life actually became stunted compared to other athletes. And this isn't something that I just made up online, right? This is an image right here from a paper that I was reading that's indexed over on PubMed that looked at motor development and the expression of strength and power in athletes. And when you read that, it really starts to explain why this new approach in golf was starting to work so well, where those athletes weren't just practicing harder, they were developing the movement foundations that allow explosive rotational movements to happen. And they were learning them when the neurological windows were still open. And then later they were layering the skills like ball striking on top of that, and it was working out awesome. So after reading that stuff, I started tinkering, right? I started testing kids for some of those different motor control issues that affect how well they can rotate. And to give you an idea about how one of those things can affect the swing, let me show you just one piece here that's all about something called core control. So here's an example. This is a kid who has poor core control. Do you see how when he goes down into his push-up, his back starts to arch and sag right there? He doesn't have the ability to properly brace his core. And so when a kid fails our core bracing test, what we often see when we go look at their swing is something like this, where this is a girl also who failed the core bracing test. And when she swings, what her body does is she says, oh, I don't have control over this part of my body, so I'm going to put that part of my body into a weird position so I can seek stability, because the body is always trying to find the most stable position possible to accomplish the task, which is to hit a ball. So what she does is she arches her back and gets into this strange position so she can make contact. But the problem is that's not a position elite hitters ever get into, and it's actually a very weak position because it's never going to allow her to transfer rotational energy efficiently through her body when she's set up that way. So once we started testing for all of these different motor control issues, something really interesting started to happen. They almost always perfectly map to all the swing flaws that people always complain about that you always hear, right? So standing up in the swing, losing posture, rolling over, struggling to generate bat speed, not using your legs. So to everyone else on the outside and to most hitting coaches out there, this always looks like a swing problem. But the real issue is that the body doesn't have the stability to support the movements that we're asking the kids to do with their swings. And once I started paying attention to that, I started noticing something else. A lot of the kids who struggle with bat speed, it wasn't because they were lazy, it wasn't because they weren't coachable, it wasn't because they weren't trying hard, they were actually missing those foundational movement patterns. And when you start fixing those movement patterns first, a lot of those swing problems that people obsess about just start to fix themselves. So when we work with hitters now, before we ever start talking about fixing their swing, we run them through a series of movement screens. Those screens look at major categories of movement that affect bat speed and contact quality. Things like proprioception, core control, pelvic control, upper and lower body disassociation, and a few other movement patterns that directly affect how well an athlete can rotate. And what we found is that when kids struggle with bat speed in particular, they almost always have deficiencies in one of these couple of categories. So in the next video in this series, I'm gonna walk you through 3 really simple tests that you can run on your hitter today that will tell you very quickly whether your athlete has a movement foundation necessary to develop real bat speed or if they still need to be building it. Because if they fail those tests that we're gonna give you, it's a huge clue that the problem isn't their swing mechanics, it's the movement patterns underneath the swing. And this is actually why my daughter was able to hit that home run you saw earlier, even though she's one of the smallest players on the field, because instead of only training contact, like all her coaches were trying to get her to do at the time, we spent a lot of time developing those movement foundations that allow explosive rotational athleticism to explode. And once those were unlocked, that power started to show up naturally. So in the next video, again, I'm gonna show you the first movement test that we run on almost every hitter we work with. It's a few tests that a surprising number of athletes will fail. And when they do, it explains a lot about why they struggle to generate their bat speed. So go watch that video next, and I'll show you how to run that test with your hitter in the next video.